Okay, everyone, here we are now for the final part, final video lecture, part 3 for chapter 11. In this one, we're going to focus more on human activities and conservation ecology aspects of these questions we've had or looked at about population density, intraspecific population regulation, and so on. So, the conservation of populations requires an understanding of something called minimum viable population size and also carrying capacity. So important questions here are how can human activities lead to population declines in other species? It's important to know how it is that the things that we do impact other species, and how do conservation ecologists develop a plan to determine how many individuals and how large an area are needed to sustain a population. Let's say we're setting up a reserve. You know how much area you need to sustain a population of a given size. So, human activities often affect other organisms through loss or degradation of their habitat. Okay, habitat loss is one of the primary drivers of species extinction. Some populations are now restricted to protected areas. Obviously, we know that, living on reserves. And the question is how do we decide how large those protected areas need to be to keep that population viable for the long term? So this is where the concept of minimum viable population comes into play. We just usually refer to this as MVP. Okay, so minimum viable population. This is the number of individuals necessary to ensure the long-term survival of a species. Well, define long-term. Typically, this is defined as a 99% chance of survival for 1,000 years, right? So 99% chance of survival for 1,000 years. That's sort of a baseline, a standard in conservation ecology. So the thing is that the number has to be large enough to withstand chance variations in various things. So chance variation in what? Well, births and deaths. We have chance variation in environment, so environmental changes, in other words, that can be random. We have genetic drift as a source of chance variation, which we talked about, and we have catastrophic events such as floods, hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, whatever. So the minimum viable population size must be large enough to withstand chance variations in these things, right? In other words, we're sort of hedging our bets here, having a large enough population that can withstand randomness in births and deaths, environmental changes, genetic drift. Sorry, I forgot to include that. Genetic drift and catastrophic events. So, how do we determine MVP? How do we determine the minimum viable population size? Well, it depends on quite a few factors, obviously. It depends on the life history of the species and the ability of individuals to disperse among available habitat patches. Genetic models suggest that vertebrates with populations of an actual size less than 1,000 are highly vulnerable to extinction. For species that have large fluctuations in population size, like a lot of invertebrates, for example, and annual plants, the estimated MVP is often in the range of 10,000. So you're talking about really large populations, relatively speaking. So how do we determine this minimum viable population size? Well, there's a process called population viability analysis. Okay, so population viability analysis, or PVA for short. Basically, this is a statistical method of assessing the risk of extinction using the characteristics of a species and environmental variability. So it's going to forecast population dynamics and extinction risk. PVA is developed for a specific population, so each one's going to be unique. All right, so as an example, an Australian research group used population viability analysis to estimate the minimum viable population sizes for 102 species of vertebrates across different groups. they define the size of an MVP as one with a 99% probability of lasting for 40 generations. So the mean MVP result from their study was 7,316 adults. The median MVP was 5,816 adults. And they did not differ among major taxa or with geography, but were negatively correlated with the growth rate of the population. Well, why would that be? In other words, the minimum viable population size goes down as growth rate of the population goes up, because a population that's growing faster can recover more quickly from catastrophic events, population declines resulting from that, and so on, so they have a better chance of surviving at a lower population density than another population with a lower growth rate. All right, and so this is sort of showing the results of this study. Each one of these dots is one of those 102 populations that they studied. And so here we have the natural log of the growth rate, population growth rate, okay? And here we have the natural log of the minimum viable population size. You can see that as growth rate goes up, there's a slight negative correlation there in terms of minimum viable population size. So populations that have higher growth rates need lower MVPs than populations that have lower growth rates. And that makes sense. Okay, so once the minimum viable population for a species has been figured out, the area needed to support that population needs to be estimated. All right, this is referred to as the minimum dynamic area, or MDA for short. Okay, so this is just the amount of land basically that population would need to persist. So you need to understand the carrying capacity of the habitat, obviously, the home range size of individuals, family groups, or colonies. The more space individuals, family groups, or colonies need, the larger the MDA would need to be. So this is going to give an estimate of the area requirement per individual in the population. All right, so here's a graph with a lot going on. So we know that large parks, like national parks, for example, contain larger populations of each species than small parks do. Only the largest parks may contain long-term viable populations of many large vertebrate species. Each symbol in this figure represents an animal population in a park. All right, so you see we have red is large carnivores, blue is large herbivores, green is small herbivores. Okay. If the minimum viable population of a species is 1,000, that's our dashed line here, 10 to the third 1,000, then you can see that parks of at least 100 hectares are going to be needed, okay, to protect small herbivores. Parks of more than, let's say, 10,000 are going to be needed to protect large herbivores, and parks of size of at least 1 million hectares will be needed to protect large carnivores. So big difference in terms of the MDA, minimum dynamic area, depending on what kind of species you're talking about, large carnivore, large herbivore, small herbivore. All right, so with an estimate for both MDA and MVP, the area needed to maintain a viable population can be determined. For large carnivores, this can be a really huge area. The estimate for a population of 1,000 grizzly bears is 2 million square kilometers. That's enormous. And this is exactly why most large carnivore populations are endangered and are now only found in very large public land areas and nature reserves, because humans just swallow up so much area with our activities and habitat destruction that we do. So a study on bighorn sheep populations by a biologist at the University of Montana provides one of the best documented cases of MVP size. This researcher and his group examined 120 populations. All the populations with fewer than 50 individuals became extinct within 50 years, and all populations with 100 or more individuals survived over that same time period. Again, showing that smaller populations are more likely to go extinct because maybe they haven't reached that MVP threshold, whereas larger populations probably have. Okay. And here we see the relationship between the size of the population of bighorn sheep um, and the percentage of populations that persist over time. All right. So in B, panel B down here, what we see is that N represents our population size, right? So we have N of 15, N of 16 to 30, and so on, different lines. And almost all populations of 100 or more sheep persisted beyond 50 years, whereas populations with fewer than 50 individuals did not. So here we have fewer than 50 for this line, for this one, and for this one. And by the end of 50 years, they had, if you look at the percent of population persisting, basically gone extinct. But for those populations of 51 to 100 or 101 or more, they persisted. And in the case of the largest one, was doing as well at the end of the study as they have been doing at the beginning of the study. All right. And by the way, these researchers probably did not study this for 50 years. Obviously, that's longer than the career of any one person. Typically, they're looking at government data where these populations have been tracked for long periods of time. Okay, so a species rarely occurs as a single continuous population. We've talked about that already. Most are fragmented or found in specific suitable habitats within a landscape. We've talked about how this results in a metapopulation structure, a metapopulation living in a habitat patches connected by dispersal. The metapopulation persists through the complex interactions among the subpopulations. And so dispersal is an important aspect here. You're also, if you're looking at the overall persistence of that metapopulation through time, you have to take into account the size of the local populations, because you could have very, very small subpopulations that are lower than the MVP, and they're sort of viewed as sinks because individuals can disperse to them from larger populations, but it's the dispersal of those individuals to the smaller populations that maybe keeps those smaller populations going. If dispersal is cut off and those smaller populations are left to their own devices, maybe they're too small and they just eventually peter out and go extinct. You could have larger populations supplying them. Those larger populations are referred to as sources because presumably they have a population size larger than the MVP, or at least as large as they can persist on their own and send out migrants or through dispersal that sort of keeps these smaller adjacent satellite or subpopulations going. And so dispersal then can be a very important aspect of keeping the overall metapopulation going for the long term. Okay, so that is the end then of the chapter 11 on intraspecific competition. So I'll be working on the next chapter's video lecture here shortly, and you can expect an email about that when it's ready. All right.